He was a billionaire who had lost his will to live, until a homeless little girl stole his car to save his life, and ended up changing her own forever. Evening at the Crystal Shore Hotel always arrived with the same polished elegance, a kind of orchestrated perfection that made the world outside its glass doors feel distant and unreal. Chauffeurs in crisp uniforms guided sleek black cars into position, bellboys hurried forward with practiced smiles, and the golden lights of the lobby glowed like a promise that nothing truly bad could happen here. Yet just beyond the glow, in the shadowed corner of the parking structure where polished marble gave way to concrete and oil stains, a 7-year-old girl sat quietly beside a support column, her small knees pulled to her chest. Emily Rivers, with tangled blonde hair and a red t-shirt faded from wear, nibbled at half of yesterday's sandwich as if it were a fragile treasure she needed to make last. She had learned the rhythms of this place the way some children learn school schedules. She knew which guard turned a blind eye, which trash bin held food that hadn't yet spoiled, and which hours she could move without being noticed by anyone too important. Life had taught her to be invisible. But tonight something was different. A commotion rose near the hotel doors, sharp voices, hurried footsteps, and then the unmistakable sound of someone struggling to stand. Emily peeked around the concrete column, instinctively silent, and saw a tall man being half-carried by a security guard. The man's dark hair, usually styled with precision, clung damply to his forehead, his elegant blue suit looked suddenly too heavy for his weakening frame. Even from a distance she could tell something was terribly wrong. "Mr. Clark, please, you need to sit," the guard insisted, tightening his grip as the man swayed dangerously. Matthew Clark, a name Emily didn't know but a face the world often recognized, seemed barely aware of his surroundings. His breaths came unevenly, and his eyes kept losing focus as though he were drifting somewhere far away. The guard opened the rear door of a luxury car and practically lowered Matthew inside, glancing around in panic as he searched for the missing driver. No one responded. The idling engine hummed uselessly. The guard was fumbling with his radio, muttering curses under his breath. Time stretched painfully as Emily watched Matthew's head slump to one side, his lips paling, his breathing turning shallow. She knew that look. She had seen adults collapse before, people who hadn't eaten for days or who had drunk too much or who had simply given up. This man wasn't drunk or angry or unconscious from despair. He was slipping away quickly, and no one around him realized how little time he had. Emily felt a spark of fear twist in her chest, but it was followed immediately by something else, urgency, a kind of brave instinct she didn't fully understand. Her small fingers clenched around the fabric of her jeans as she rose to her feet. She approached the car quietly at first, not wanting to startle anyone. The guard noticed her too late. She leaned in just enough to see Matthew more clearly, his chest barely rising, his hand twitching weakly as though he were trying to hold on to something only he could see. She took a step toward the driver's door. The guard reacted immediately, stepping in front of her with an outstretched arm. "Hey! Stop! What are you doing?" His voice was sharp, strained by panic and stress. Emily pointed at Matthew inside the car. "He needs a hospital," she said simply, her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her chest. "He's not breathing right." The guard's frustration exploded into shouting. "You can't drive. Do you hear me? You're a kid. Step back." His anger wasn't really meant for her, it was meant for the crisis spiraling out of control. But Emily didn't flinch. She wasn't thinking about rules or grown-up anger or consequences. She was thinking about the man who might die in the back seat if she didn't do something. She looked at the empty front of the car, no driver, no one else coming, no help in sight. The guard tried to grab her shoulder, but Emily moved faster than he expected. She ducked under his arm, sprinted to the driver's side, yanked the door open, and threw herself onto the seat. She had done this before, only once, when a kind man back in her old neighborhood had let her sit on his lap and turn the wheel of his truck while he controlled the pedals. But she remembered enough. Her heart pounded as her small hands gripped the steering wheel. Before the guard could reach her, she slammed the door shut and locked it with a quick click that echoed like defiance. Matthew's faint groan reached her ears, and that alone was enough to steady her shaking breath. She didn't look back at the guard's shocked face. Her foot hit the pedal, and the car surged forward, leaving the hotel lights shrinking behind her in the rearview mirror. Emily's eyes stayed glued to the road, her knuckles turning white as she maneuvered through traffic with a determination that dwarfed her size. She didn't think about what would happen to her afterward, or how much trouble she might be in. She only thought about reaching the hospital in time. Matthew Clark was dying. And she was the only one who could save him. Emily had never driven anything larger than an old pickup truck she once sat in while a neighbor guided her hands, but the luxury sedan responded to her touch with surprising smoothness. The wheel felt too big beneath her small fingers, the leather too cold, and the pedals too far from her feet, but adrenaline sharpened her instincts. She slid forward on the seat until she could reach everything, stretching her legs as far as they would go. The car jerked once as she found the right pressure on the accelerator, but after that she steadied it, weaving into the flow of traffic with a focus so intense it blotted out the rest of the world. Her heart hammered against her ribs in a painful rhythm, yet her mind remained strangely calm. She kept glancing into the rearview mirror, where Matthew lay slumped sideways, barely breathing. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven motions, and sometimes it paused just long enough to make Emily panic before starting again. Back at the hotel entrance, Harry Brooks sprinted after the car, shouting for her to stop, but his voice faded quickly as Emily accelerated. She didn't let herself think about him. She didn't let herself think about what would happen if she got caught. All she saw was the pale, weakening man behind her and the blur of streetlights streaking past the windshield as she pushed forward through the city night. Cars honked when she misjudged a merge, but she corrected herself quickly, tightening her grip on the wheel until her hands hurt. She remembered the neighbor telling her once, "Steady hands, kid. Don't fight the car, guide it." So she guided it, breath by breath, through yellow lights and crowded intersections. Once, a taxi nearly clipped her as she swerved around a stalled vehicle, and fear spiked in her throat like a scream she couldn't release. But the image of Matthew lying helpless kept her from stopping. She whispered to herself, a steady chant of courage she didn't even know she had, it's okay, just keep going, don't stop." She didn't dare look around, the entire city felt too big and too bright, every noise amplified. Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes burned from not blinking enough. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, the glowing red cross of the hospital appeared in the distance. Relief hit so suddenly that she nearly lost her grip on the wheel. She guided the car into the emergency driveway, braked too sharply, and the vehicle lurched to a stop that jolted her forward. Her hands were shaking violently now, her breath coming in shallow gulps. But she didn't pause. She tore off her seat belt, threw open the door, and ran to the back seat. Sir, we're here," she whispered as she tugged at Matthew's arm. His skin felt too cold, his body too heavy for her small hands to manage. She tried shaking him gently, then calling for help with a voice that cracked midway into panic. 2 nurses rushed out, confusion flashing across their faces as they took in the bizarre sight of a little girl hauling an unconscious billionaire out of the back of a luxury sedan. "How did he get here? Where's the driver?" one of them asked breathlessly. Emily opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The adrenaline that had carried her all the way here suddenly left her body, and her knees nearly buckled. The nurses didn't wait for an explanation. They lifted Matthew onto a gurney, shouting orders to each other as they rushed him through the automatic doors. Emily followed, her steps unsteady, her throat tight. She stood just inside the entrance, hugging her arms around herself as the medical team disappeared down a hallway with the man she had risked everything to save. Someone placed a warm hand on her shoulder. She turned and found herself looking up at a woman in scrubs, Dr. Lauren Hale, though she didn't know her name yet. Lauren crouched down to Emily's level, her expression soft but probing. "Sweetheart, did you bring him here?" she asked gently. Emily nodded, still panting, still shaking. He couldn't breathe right, she whispered. No one else was driving. Lauren blinked, stunned by the clarity and bravery in the child's voice. She pulled Emily into a steadying embrace, something the girl hadn't felt in years. You did the right thing, Lauren murmured. You might have saved his life. Emily wanted to believe her, wanted to let that warmth sink into her bones, but fear clung to her like a shadow. She stared down the hallway where the gurney had disappeared, silently begging the universe not to let her effort be too late. As nurses and doctors swarmed around her in controlled chaos, Emily stood in the middle of it all, exhausted, trembling, and utterly alone, but for the first time since she had begun living on the streets, she wasn't invisible. People were looking at her with shock, curiosity, and something she had forgotten existed, concern. She didn't yet know that everything in her life had begun to change the moment she touched that steering wheel. But the truth was already unfolding. And Emily Rivers had just altered the course of a billionaire's life, and her own, forever. Emily spent the night in a stiff plastic chair outside the emergency ward, her legs folded beneath her and her chin resting on her knees. The hospital corridor buzzed with activity, nurses wheeled carts of medication past her, doctors hurried between rooms, patients groaned behind closed curtains, but none of it felt real. Her world had shrunk to the narrow strip of hallway in front of her and the memory of Matthew's face, pale and still, as the nurses rushed him away. Every time a door opened, she flinched, hoping someone would come out and tell her he was all right, and terrified that they might tell her he wasn't. She knew she had done everything she could, but fear crawled beneath her skin, whispering terrible possibilities. What if she had driven too slowly? What if she'd chosen the wrong road? What if she had failed him anyway? It must have been after midnight when Dr. Lauren Hale returned, her expression softened by fatigue but lined with compassion. She found Emily exactly where she had left her, curled up like a small, frightened animal. Lauren sat beside her, careful not to startle her. He's stable for now, she said quietly. Emily's eyes shot up at those words, wide and teary. He is? She asked, her voice barely more than breath. Lauren nodded. You got him here in time. Whatever you saw, whatever made you act, you were right. If he had arrived even 10 minutes later, we might not have been able to help him. Emily's throat clenched, and she lowered her gaze to hide the sudden rush of emotion. She wasn't used to being praised, praise made her feel unsteady, like the ground beneath her feet was shifting. Lauren placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You did something extraordinary, Emily. Truly extraordinary. The girl only nodded, unsure how to respond. Exhaustion tugged at her eyelids, but she refused to fall asleep. What if he woke up and needed help? What if someone needed to know what she had seen? Lauren eventually convinced her to move to one of the empty family waiting rooms, promising to check on Matthew and return if anything changed. Emily reluctantly followed, her feet dragging. The small room had a couch, a lamp, and a stack of magazines she was too young to understand. She sat on the couch with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the patterned carpet until her vision blurred. Within minutes, despite her determination to stay awake, her body surrendered, and she drifted into a restless sleep filled with flashing streetlights, sirens that never appeared, and Matthew's shallow breathing echoing in the dark. She woke to the rustle of someone entering the room. Disoriented, she jumped slightly, her heart racing, until she recognized Lauren. Sunlight filtered weakly through the frosted window, telling Emily she had slept longer than she intended. He's awake, Lauren said with a small smile. He's asking questions. Emily's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure why she felt nervous, maybe because she wasn't used to being around adults who wanted to speak to her, maybe because she feared he might be angry that a child had driven his car like a runaway thief. Lauren led her through the hall to a private room where Matthew lay in a hospital bed, pale but conscious. His dark hair was tousled against the crisp white pillow, and an 4-line trailed from his arm. When Emily stepped inside, He turned his head slowly, studying her with clear but tired eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily expected anger or confusion or disbelief. What she didn't expect was softness. "You're the little girl who drove me here," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Aren't you?" Emily nodded awkwardly, clutching the hem of her red t-shirt. I saw you couldn't breathe right," she murmured. "And nobody else was taking you anywhere." Matthew blinked, the memory coming back to him in broken fragments, the faintest awareness of movement, the sound of a young voice calling to him, the scent of old denim and dust. He swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the realization of how close he had come to dying, and how unlikely his salvation had been. Lauren spoke softly from behind Emily. "She saved your life, Matthew." She reacted when everyone else froze. Matthew's gaze returned to Emily, sharper now but filled with something like gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You were incredibly brave." Emily shifted uncomfortably, unused to such attention. "I just didn't want you to die," she whispered. "People die sometimes when no one helps." Her words hit Matthew with an unexpected force. He could hear the experience behind them, old wounds threaded through a young voice. He wanted to ask where her parents were, why a child her age was wandering around outside luxury hotels alone, but he sensed the fragility beneath her calm exterior. "So instead," he said, "I'm glad you were there." Emily looked up at him, surprised. Most adults didn't say things like that to her. Most adults didn't notice her at all. Lauren moved closer, resting a hand lightly on Emily's back. "We'll need to contact social services soon," she said gently, directing the comment more toward Matthew than the girl. Immediately Emily's body tensed, her shoulders tightening as though bracing for impact. Matthew noticed and frowned. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Emily shook her head quickly, but her wide eyes betrayed her fear. She had been through the system before. It had never ended well. Lauren sighed softly, recognizing the shift in the girl's demeanor. "Emily has been living near your hotel for some time," she explained. "She doesn't have anyone looking after her." Matthew stared at the small child before him, this brave girl who had risked everything for a stranger, and something in him twisted painfully. He knew what vulnerability looked like, he knew the emptiness that followed loss. He saw all of it in her. Emily dropped her gaze, fidgeting with the hem of her jeans. "I don't need anyone," she muttered quietly, as if fearing that admitting otherwise would make her weaker. Matthew shook his head slowly. "Everyone needs someone," he said. "Even me." She looked up at him, startled, as if the notion that someone like him could ever be lonely was unthinkable. In that moment, an unspoken connection formed between them, fragile but real, born not out of circumstance alone but out of something deeper, the realization that both of them, in very different ways, had been abandoned by the world. And neither of them knew it yet, but their lives had already begun to change in ways neither could have imagined. Emily lingered near the doorway while Matthew spoke quietly with Dr. Hale, trying to absorb everything the doctor was telling him. Though her name wasn't mentioned at first, she listened intently, her instincts sharpened by years of needing to catch the pieces of conversations that dictated her fate. She heard snippets, words like malnutrition, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and stress indicators. They weren't about Matthew. They were about her. Dr. Hale wasn't speaking with judgment, only concern, but concern alone was enough to make Emily's stomach knot. She wasn't used to adults discussing her well-being as if it mattered. She wasn't sure if she wanted it to. Matthew kept glancing toward the doorway, toward her, while the doctor explained what they had learned from a basic health examination they'd given her while she slept in the waiting room. "She's been on the streets for a long time," Lauren said. "Longer than a child her age should ever be. She's coping well, all things considered, but she needs stability, food she doesn't have to search for, and a safe place to sleep. She needs someone who actually looks at her and sees her." Matthew felt something twist deep in his chest. He looked at Emily again, the way she held herself, small shoulders tight, hands half hidden in the hem of her red shirt as though preparing to bolt if the wrong words were spoken. When he met her eyes, she looked away instantly, not out of disrespect but out of habit. Hiding had become her survival reflex. "Can I talk to her alone?" Matthew asked. Lauren gave a gentle nod and stepped out, closing the door softly behind her. Emily had inched backward until her shoulders pressed against the cool wall, her eyes darting briefly to the window as if calculating distance and consequences. Matthew didn't move closer, instead he sat back against the pillows, giving her space. "You don't have to be afraid," he said gently. "Nothing is going to happen to you that you don't want." She didn't answer. Instead, she studied his face, probably looking for signs of the anger or disappointment she had come to expect from adults. She found none, and that seemed to confuse her more than anything else. After a moment she whispered, "They always say that. And then they take you away." Matthew's heart clenched. He had been unprepared for the raw honesty of her words. "Who takes you away?" he asked softly. Emily hesitated, her eyes shifting toward the window again. "People who say they'll help. People who put you in places where no one listens. Places where you're just another kid they have to deal with." She kicked lightly at the floor with the toe of her shoe, her voice dropping further. "I ran away because they never cared if I came back." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with meaning. Matthew felt something inside him growing warmer, sharper, and more protective than anything he'd felt since his wife passed years ago. This child who had saved his life didn't know kindness as anything more than a fleeting accident. He couldn't understand how that was possible, not in a world with so much excess, so many people who could help. How had everyone missed her? "I care," Matthew said finally, his voice steady and sincere. "And I'm not saying that just to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true. You saved my life when you didn't have a single reason to. And now I want to help you, the way you helped me." Emily looked at him cautiously, her eyes narrowing with uncertainty. "Why? Because you feel like you owe me?" It wasn't defiant, just tired. Matthew shook his head. "Because no one should have to face the world alone, especially not someone as brave as you. And because I want to." Emily didn't look convinced, but something in her expression softened, just slightly. She stepped away from the wall and moved to the foot of his bed, still keeping a safe distance. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. It was the question she had been afraid to voice from the beginning. Matthew drew a slow breath, mindful of the weight of the moment. "Right now, Dr. Hale and I are going to figure out the safest way to keep you with people who actually care about what happens to you." "You mean social workers," Emily muttered, her voice flattening. Matthew shook his head. "No. I mean me, if you'll let me help." Emily's head snapped up in surprise. She stared at him as if he had spoken in another language. "You," she repeated. "But you're important. You're rich. You have a big job. People like you don't take care of kids they don't know." "People like me," Matthew said quietly, "owe their lives to kids like you." Her lips parted, and for a moment she didn't seem to know how to respond. She had heard empty promises before, but this felt different. Matthew wasn't making a grand speech. He wasn't offering something he didn't understand. He was simply telling her the truth as he saw it. And though Emily didn't trust easily, she recognized sincerity when it stood right in front of her. Before either of them could say more, the door slid open and Harry Brooks stepped inside, out of breath and wide-eyed. His uniform was rumpled, and his usually stern expression had been replaced by something that looked strangely like guilt. "Mr. Clark," he began, then hesitated as he noticed Emily. She stiffened instantly, bracing for another scolding. Harry looked at her with regret etched into every line of his face. I'm sorry, kid," he said awkwardly. I shouldn't have yelled at you. And I shouldn't have stopped you. If it weren't for you, he wouldn't be here. Emily blinked in shock. She had never seen a grown man, much less one as intimidating as Harry, apologize to her. She didn't know what to do with the feeling it stirred. Matthew watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Harry cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. I brought your bag, he added, holding out Emily's small, worn backpack as if it were the most fragile object he had ever handled. Emily stepped forward and took it from him slowly, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. When Harry left, she turned back to Matthew, her grip tightening on the backpack straps. Why are people acting different because of me? She asked. I'm still the same person. Matthew smiled gently. Because sometimes people need a reminder of what really matters. And you gave them one. For the first time since she arrived at the hospital, Emily allowed herself to sit in the chair beside his bed. She didn't speak again, but she didn't retreat either. And in that quiet moment, Matthew realized that she was beginning, very cautiously, to trust him, not because he asked for her trust, but because he treated her like she deserved it. Neither of them knew exactly what would come next, but the shift had already happened. Something fragile. Something important. Something that felt very much like the beginning of a bond neither had expected to find. Matthew barely slept that night. Even with the steady rhythm of hospital machines filling the room, his mind refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily behind the wheel, her small hands gripping it with desperate determination, her face illuminated by streetlights as she risked her life for his. He had spent years insulated by wealth, privilege, and carefully controlled environments, yet when his life had hung in the balance, it wasn't a security team, a private doctor, or any of his associates who had saved him. It was a child who had no one, a child the world had dismissed as invisible. The weight of that truth pressed on him in waves as dawn softened the dark edges of the room. Emily had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, curled into a tight ball with her worn backpack hugged to her chest. For a long moment, Matthew simply watched her breathe. He saw how exhaustion pulled at her small features, how her hair fell unevenly across her cheek, how thin her wrists looked where they peeked out from the sleeves of her red t-shirt. She reminded him painfully of a child trying to take up as little space as possible, as if she expected to be asked to leave at any moment. It broke something inside him. He didn't know her story, not in full, but he knew enough to realize she wasn't safe outside these walls. When she finally stirred awake, it was with a jolt, as though her dreams had not been peaceful ones. Her eyes darted around the room before settling on him, and relief softened her expression. You're still here, she whispered, as if expecting him to have vanished as quickly as other people in her life had. Matthew offered her a gentle smile. I'm not going anywhere. Emily nodded, gripping her backpack straps a little tighter. A few hours later, a social worker named Mrs. Daniels arrived, clipboard in hand, expression pleasant but impersonal. She greeted Matthew warmly, but her attention soon shifted to Emily with the detached politeness of someone who had practiced concern more than she felt it. Sweetheart, she said, kneeling slightly, we need to discuss some things about where you'll be staying. Emily instantly retreated backward until her legs pressed against the chair. Her breathing quickened. Matthew recognized the panic rising in her before she even said a word. I don't want to go, Emily murmured, shaking her head. Please, I don't want to go. I don't want to go back. Her voice grew more urgent, cracking at the edges. I can't go there again. They don't listen. They never listen. Mrs. Daniels straightened, expression tightening with something like practiced sympathy. We'll find a safe place for you. You'll have a bed, meals, adults to talk to. No, Emily said sharply, her voice trembling. She looked at Matthew with wide, pleading eyes, silently begging him to do something, anything. Matthew felt his heart twist. He couldn't stand the fear in her voice, not after everything she'd done for him. He cleared his throat and spoke with a firmness that surprised even him. She's not leaving with anyone until I understand exactly what's going to happen. Mrs. Daniels looked at him in mild surprise. Mr. Clark, I understand you feel protective, but this child needs to be placed into proper care. Temporary housing, foster evaluation, foster homes, Emily whispered under her breath, her face tightening. They move you around. They yell if you don't do things right. They lock food away. Nobody wants you there. She clutched her backpack until her knuckles turned white. Please don't let them take me. Mrs. Daniels sighed and stood a little straighter, speaking in the rehearsed tone of someone imposing rules. Mr. Clark, with all due respect, unless you're a family or a legal guardian, you do not have the authority to intervene in this matter. Matthew's jaw tightened. He could feel a slow burn of anger rising inside him, the kind that came from watching injustice occur right before his eyes. Emily had protected him when she had no reason to. He couldn't sit back and let her be handed off to a system that had failed her repeatedly. Then I'll become her guardian, he said without hesitation. Mrs. Daniels blinked, stunned. I'm sorry, what? I want to apply for emergency temporary guardianship, Matthew repeated more clearly. And afterward, permanent guardianship. Emily stared at him, her lips parting as if she didn't quite understand the words. Matthew continued before the social worker could respond. I know how this sounds. But she saved my life. And I'm not going to let her go back to a system that neglected her. Mrs. Daniels seemed flustered now, flipping through her paperwork as though searching for a protocol to follow. This is extremely unusual, Mr. Clark. Guardianship applications take time. Background checks, home inspections, psychological evaluations, then start them, he said. Today. Emily's breath hitched. You mean, you want me to stay? She whispered. Matthew met her gaze, and everything in him settled into clarity. Yes, Emily. I want you to stay. But only if you want to. She nodded so fiercely her blonde hair scattered around her face. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away as if afraid crying would make her seem less worthy. Matthew felt something warm spread through his chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Mrs. Daniels, still overwhelmed, scribbled notes on her clipboard. I'll speak to my supervisor, she said finally. This isn't something we handle lightly. She left the room with hurried steps, clearly rattled. After the door closed, Emily slowly approached the side of Matthew's bed. She didn't speak for several long seconds. Her small fingers fidgeted with the zipper of her backpack, her chin trembling despite her efforts to hide it. Finally, in a whisper afraid of its own hope, she asked, Are you sure? I don't want to be a problem. Matthew reached out and gently placed his hand over hers. Emily, he said softly, you are not a problem. You're the reason I'm alive. And I want to make sure you never have to be afraid of losing everything again. For the first time since he had met her, Emily allowed herself to smile, not wide, not fully, but enough to reveal a glimmer of trust. A glimmer of belonging. In that small hospital room, amid wires, dim lights, and quiet machinery, something irreversible happened. A connection solidified between a man who had lost his way and a child who had never been given one. And though neither knew exactly how complicated the road ahead would be, both understood one truth. Their lives were no longer separate. Their futures had just become intertwined. Matthew was discharged from the hospital 2 days after the social worker's visit, though Dr. Hale insisted on a strict medication schedule and follow-up appointments. He agreed to everything without argument, not because he feared for his health, but because he feared letting Emily down. She walked beside him as he left the hospital, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her steps small and hesitant. The world outside felt enormous to her now. She wasn't returning to the familiar corners of the parking garage or the shadows she used as shelter. She was stepping into something unknown, something she wanted desperately but didn't dare trust completely. A black car from Matthew's personal fleet waited by the curb, but this time a train driver stood ready. Emily stiffened at the sight of the vehicle, memories of her frantic night behind the wheel flickering through her mind. Matthew noticed immediately. "You don't have to get in if you're scared," he said gently. She shook her head, embarrassed. "I'm not scared. I just don't like going places when I don't know where I'll end up." Matthew's expression softened. "You'll end up exactly where you choose to go. And right now, you're choosing to come with me." Inside the car, Emily sat pressed against the door at first, her body angled as if she needed a clear escape route. Matthew didn't push her to relax. Instead, he talked to her the way he wished someone had talked to him after he lost his wife years earlier, calmly, honestly, without treating her like something fragile that might break under truth. He told her that social services had begun the guardianship evaluation, that it might take time, that nothing was guaranteed yet, but he would fight for her every step of the way. She listened silently, her fingers twisting the strap of her backpack again and again, but her shoulders began to ease their rigid posture. When they arrived at Matthew's home, a sprawling but warm two-story house surrounded by oaks and soft light, Emily froze on the driveway. It wasn't the size that overwhelmed her, though the house looked like something out of the stories she used to read discarded in junk bins. It was the idea of stepping through a door that belonged to someone who actually wanted her there. The idea of belonging at all. Matthew stepped out and offered her a small smile. "It's big," he admitted. "And maybe a little intimidating. But there's nothing inside that can hurt you. No yelling, no locked fridges, no rules designed to make you disappear." Emily blinked at that. He had heard her earlier fears more clearly than she expected. "You can explore," he added. "Or stay close to me. Whatever makes you feel safe." She chose to stay close at first. She followed him inside, clutching her backpack, her eyes darting around the foyer as if expecting someone to jump out and tell her a mistake had been made. The house was quiet, peacefully quiet, instead of the tense silence she remembered from overcrowded shelters. Matthew led her to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. "If you're hungry, take whatever you want. You don't need permission." Emily stepped closer slowly, her eyes scanning the shelves full of fresh food. She reached out, touched an apple, then pulled her hand back as if it were too precious for her to touch. Matthew gently nudged it toward her. "Food isn't earned here. It's given." She took the apple. After lunch, he showed her what would become her room if the guardianship went through. It wasn't decorated yet, just a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the backyard. Emily walked to the window and touched the glass, almost surprised it opened to something peaceful instead of an alley or a crowded street. "If you want to make it yours, you can," Matthew said. "Paint, toys, books, whatever you want. But it's yours only if you like it. You don't have to stay here if you don't want to." Emily swallowed hard. "I've never had a room before," she whispered. The confession was small, but it hit Matthew like a blow. She wasn't bragging or seeking pity. She was simply stating a fact, the same way someone might say they'd never seen snow. That night, she stayed awake long after the lights went out. Matthew left her door open on purpose, and she kept glancing toward the hallway, as though checking whether someone would shut it, scold her, or move her somewhere else. When footsteps passed by, she tensed, until she realized it was just Matthew checking if she needed anything, not because he didn't trust her, but because he cared. In the early hours of the morning, Matthew heard soft cries coming from her room. Not loud sobs, just tiny, muffled whimpers like a frightened kitten trying not to be noticed. He knocked lightly. "Emily? Can I come in?" After a long silence, she whispered, "Okay." She sat on the bed with her knees pulled to her chest, tears staining her cheeks despite her effort to wipe them away. "Are you in pain?" he asked gently, sitting in the chair near her bed instead of beside her, letting her decide the distance. She shook her head. "No. I don't know how to be here. I don't know how to be someone people want." Matthew leaned forward, his voice steady but full of feeling. Emily, you don't have to be anything. You don't have to perform or change or act a certain way. You don't have to earn a place in this house. You already matter. To me. You mattered before you even knew my name. She looked at him, confused by the sincerity she heard. But what if you change your mind, she whispered. People always change their mind. He shook his head slowly. I'm not other people. She wiped her eyes again, her movement small and uncertain. Can I stay here until you really mean that? She asked shyly. Matthew felt something break and heal inside him at the same time. You can stay here as long as you want, he said. And I already mean it. For the first time, Emily let herself lie down without clutching her backpack. She turned toward the wall, shoulders still trembling slightly, but her breathing grew steadier. Matthew stayed in the doorway until he knew she was asleep, then quietly turned off the hallway light. As he walked back to his room, he realized that the fear he had lived with for years, a fear of losing, of failing, of not being enough, had somehow begun to lift. Emily had changed something in him, just as he had changed something in her. They were no longer two people thrown together by chance. They were becoming something closer to a family. Matthew entered the next phase of the guardianship process with a determination that surprised even him. He had faced hostile boardrooms, corporate scandals, and high-stakes negotiations worth billions, but nothing had ever felt as fragile or as important as securing Emily's future. The stakes were no longer business-related, they were human, deeply personal, tied to the quiet trust forming between a man who had lost everything and a child who had never been given anything. But the road ahead wasn't easy. Social services moved slowly, weighed down by policies that didn't bend simply because someone wealthy or well-intentioned asked them to. Matthew found himself buried under paperwork, background checks, psychological assessments, and home inspections while Emily's emotions rose and fell like unsettled tides. The first home visit took place 3 days after Emily moved in. Mrs. Daniels arrived with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and a folder thick with forms. Emily stood near Matthew but didn't cling to him, she simply hovered close enough that her presence felt like a small shadow at his side. Daniels toured the house, taking notes, asking questions, checking for safety hazards. She nodded approvingly at the library, paused critically at the kitchen, and lingered longest in Emily's room. The girl watched her with quiet tension, as though expecting the woman to announce it had all been a mistake and that she needed to pack her bag immediately. Matthew noticed every flicker of fear in Emily's eyes. When Daniels asked Emily directly how she liked the home, the girl froze for several seconds before answering. I like it, she said softly. But I don't want to get used to it if I have to leave. Matthew's chest tightened. Daniels wrote the response down. Emily's shoulders tightened. It was impossible to know what she was thinking. After the social worker left, Emily retreated to her room without saying a word. Matthew found her there sitting on the floor beside the bed, her knees pulled to her chest. Did I say something wrong? She asked quietly, tracing patterns in the carpet. She wrote a lot after I talked. Matthew sat beside her, careful not to crowd her. You didn't do anything wrong. You told the truth. And I'm proud of you for that. Emily didn't answer. Instead she leaned her head against the edge of the bed, her eyes distant and stormy. Matthew placed a hand on the floor beside her, close, but not touching, letting her decide whether she wanted comfort. Slowly, she shifted closer until her shoulder brushed lightly against his arm. It was a wordless plea for reassurance, and he gave it by simply staying with her until she breathed evenly again. The following week brought new challenges. Emily was enrolled in a local school temporarily while evaluations were underway, and the overwhelming transition hit her harder than either of them expected. The building was loud, the hallways crowded, and the other children curious in ways Emily found unsettling. Teachers praised her intelligence but noted her reluctance to speak, her tendency to flinch at sudden noises, and her habit of eating her entire lunch in minutes as if afraid someone might take it. Every report made Matthew ache. He contacted Dr. Hale for advice, and she began seeing Emily regularly, helping her navigate the fears that resurfaced now that she finally had something to lose. Through it all, their bond deepened in small, quiet ways. Emily started sitting closer to Matthew during meals, sometimes offering broken bits of conversation about her day. She asked questions tentatively, as though unsure if she was allowed to be curious. At night, she fell asleep faster, though she still kept the hallway light on. She watched the driveway from her bedroom window, flinching whenever an unfamiliar car slowed near the house, terrified that someone was coming to take her away. Matthew reassured her again and again that he wasn't letting her go anywhere she didn't want to be, but trust, for Emily, was a delicate thing, earned in tiny steps, one quiet moment at a time. And then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while Matthew was working in his home office, he heard hurried footsteps racing down the hallway. Before he could rise, Emily burst into the room, breathless and wide-eyed. "There's a woman at the door," she said, panicking. "She said she's here from social services. She said she needs to talk to you right now." Matthew followed her quickly to the foyer, bracing himself for bad news. But when he opened the door, he found a different face than he expected, not Mrs. Daniels but her supervisor, Ms. Ainsley, a middle-aged woman with warm eyes and a calm demeanor. She introduced herself and asked if she could come in. Emily hovered behind Matthew, peeking nervously from behind his arm. Ainsley knelt slightly so she could address Emily directly. "Hi there, sweetheart. I just came to talk, that's all." Emily didn't answer. She hid a little more. The meeting took place in the living room. Ainsley asked thoughtful questions, not just about paperwork or home conditions, but about Emily herself. What made her feel safe? What made her feel scared? What she liked to do? Emily answered shyly at first, but Ainsley's gentle patience eventually coaxed more words out of her. Matthew sat beside her, offering quiet support whenever she stumbled. One specific moment changed the tone of the entire meeting. When asked what she wanted most right now, Emily didn't hesitate. She reached for Matthew's sleeve, gripping it softly but firmly. "I want to stay here," she whispered. Her voice trembled with vulnerability, but also with certainty. "I want to stay with him." Ainsley's eyes softened. She closed her folder slowly, as though settling into a decision. "That helps a lot," she said. "More than you realize." After she left, Emily stood in the hallway with her arms wrapped around herself, trying to interpret what had happened. She turned to Matthew, fear flickering beneath the surface. "Did I mess things up?" she asked. "I talked too much. I said too much." Matthew shook his head and crouched so he could look her in the eyes. "Emily, you didn't mess anything up. You told the truth. And it mattered." Her expression wavered, the beginnings of a smile pulling at her mouth before she hid it again behind her hair. She stepped forward timidly and leaned her forehead against his shoulder. It was the first time she initiated contact so freely, and Matthew felt something inside him shift, something warm and protective that anchored itself deep in his heart. For the first time since this journey began, the fear that had shadowed their days felt lighter, almost manageable. They still didn't know what the final decision would be. They still didn't know how long the process would take or how many obstacles remained. But something had undeniably changed. Emily no longer stood alone. And Matthew no longer felt the emptiness that had haunted him for years. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The final stage of the guardianship process arrived on a gray morning that felt heavier than any storm the sky could summon. Matthew had been preparing for weeks, completing every evaluation, interview, reference check, and home inspection with an intensity that left his legal team astonished. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting for a business deal or public reputation, he was fighting for someone who had become the most unexpected and important part of his life. Emily knew the hearing was happening that day, though no one pushed her to attend. When Matthew offered her the choice, she surprised him by insisting on coming. She wanted to be there, even if the outcome terrified her. She wanted to show she wasn't running anymore. At the courthouse, she clutched his hand tightly as they walked through the tall glass doors. Her small fingers trembled, but she didn't let go. The building felt too big, too official, too echoing, as though every footstep carried the weight of her past. Matthew watched her closely, ready to take her home if it became too much, but Emily lifted her chin and kept moving. She had faced far worse than a courtroom. Inside the hearing room, a judge with silver glasses sat behind a large wooden desk, reviewing a stack of documents. Mrs. Daniels was there, along with Ainsley and 2 additional social services representatives. Dr. Hale had volunteered to testify on Emily's behalf. Matthew's lawyer organized their papers, occasionally glancing at Emily with a reassuring nod. Emily stayed near Matthew, not hiding behind him, but not stepping far away either. She listened as the judge reviewed the case file, her heart pounding with each turn of a page. The judge began with questions directed at the social workers, asking about Emily's background, her previous placements, and her life on the streets. The words felt sharp to her, almost embarrassing, and she twisted her hands together in her lap. Then came questions for Dr. Hale, who spoke about Emily's trauma, her resilience, and the dramatic improvement in her emotional stability since living with Matthew. She explained how consistent care, affection, and safety had changed Emily in measurable ways. Emily didn't understand all the clinical terms, but she understood the warmth in Lauren's voice and the sincerity in her eyes. Then the judge turned to Matthew. He stood, steady and composed, though Emily noticed the tension in his jaw. He spoke clearly about why he wanted guardianship, not out of charity, not out of obligation, but out of genuine commitment to a child who had changed his life. He described the night she saved him, not with embellishment but with profound honesty. He explained how he had seen something in her that reminded him of what he had lost after his wife's death, a reason to keep going, a reminder that hope could come from the most unexpected places. He talked about her courage, her intelligence, her fierce loyalty. He spoke not as a billionaire accustomed to getting what he wanted, but as a man who had found something he couldn't bear to lose. The judge listened carefully, nodding thoughtfully, but Emily still couldn't read his expression. Then he asked something no one expected. He asked to speak to Emily directly. Matthew immediately knelt beside her, lowering himself to her level. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to," he whispered. She nodded slowly, her throat tight. When she stood, her legs trembled slightly. The judge's voice was gentler than she expected. "Emily, do you understand what guardianship means?" he asked. She nodded again, but then decided words mattered. "It means I get to stay," she whispered. "Or I have to leave." The judge paused, letting her words settle. "And what do you want?" Emily looked at Matthew. He wasn't staring at her anxiously, nor silently pleading, nor trying to steer her answer. He was simply watching her with quiet encouragement, letting her choose her own truth. "I want to stay with him," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He listens to me. He doesn't get mad for no reason. He doesn't make me hide. He doesn't make me feel like a problem." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "I don't want to live anywhere else. I want to be with him." The room fell completely silent. Even the clicking of pens stopped. The judge didn't answer immediately. He reviewed his notes, asked a few final procedural questions, and then announced he would step out for 20 minutes to finalize his decision. As soon as he left, Emily's legs gave out, and she sank into the chair beside Matthew. He placed a steady hand on her back, helping her breathe through her panic. The 20 minutes felt like hours. Emily twirled the end of her sleeve nervously, repeatedly checking the clock on the wall. Matthew watched her with a calm expression, but his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. When the judge finally returned, the room straightened collectively. Emily held her breath without realizing it. The judge sat, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at Matthew before turning his gaze toward her. In reviewing the documents, testimonies, and Emily's expressed wishes, he began, I find that granting Mr. Matthew Clark full legal guardianship is in the child's best interest. Emily didn't fully understand the rest of his statement, her ears filled with a ringing sound, and her breath caught in her throat. She only heard parts of it, phrases like permanent placement, stable home environment, parental rights, and approved. But Matthew heard everything, and he let out a quiet breath he'd been holding for weeks. Emily stared up at him, confused for a moment. Does that mean, she whispered. Matthew smiled, warm and relieved, and nodded. It means you're staying, he said softly. It means you're mine, Emily. You have a home. Something inside her broke open, something tightly wound by years of instability, fear, and loneliness. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and before she could overthink it, she threw her arms around Matthew, burying her face into his chest. He embraced her immediately, lifting her slightly as he held her close. The courtroom blurred into unimportant shapes around them. Social workers smiled. Dr. Hale wiped her own eyes discreetly. For the first time in her life, Emily felt the weight of certainty settle into her bones. She wouldn't be moved tomorrow. She wouldn't be forgotten or overlooked or shuffled between strangers. She wouldn't have to sleep in shadows or eat in fear or hide behind concrete pillars. She had a home. She had someone who wanted her. She had a future that stretched farther than she'd ever imagined. And as she clung to Matthew, hearing his steady heartbeat under her ear, she realized something else too, she wasn't alone anymore. They walked out of the courthouse hand in hand. The sky was still gray, heavy with clouds, but to Emily it looked brighter than any sky she had ever seen. Together they stepped forward, not as a frightened child and a grateful stranger, but as a new family beginning a life built on trust, courage, and the kind of love that grows out of saving each other. The road ahead wouldn't be perfect, but it would be theirs. And for both of them, that was enough to change everything.